I'm Graeme Nisbet. Hello, I'm Graeme Nisbet, and thank you, Jane, for giving me this opportunity to share my research from the MSc. Um, I started my MSc in 2018, and uh, was a graduate in 21. So it's quite a few years ago now. I've gone on since graduating to do a PhD at QMU in autism again. So both the MSc and my PhD are into the subject of autism. I am autistic and I identify as neurodivergent. And I will explain how my journey with mindfulness and the PhD enabled me to grow into this sense of an autistic neurodivergent identity. So uh, my PhD was entitled Mindfulness, Autism, and Making Sense. And Uh, at the time, I was kind of looking for a validation of autistic perception. Many years ago, I used to work as an artist, and I used to understand my perception in terms of color. So it was about color and form and texture. And coming to mindfulness, um, I began to find a language that was familiar in talking about sensory reasoning. So essentially, we have a kind of cognitive and linguistic reasoning, and quite different. We have a sensory reasoning, so like a perception and a reasoning. So if we're doing a mindfulness practice and then we do an inquiry, and I will say, if I was to ask you about your practice, what do you think? And then what do you feel about that? And where do you feel it in the body? I would be talking about different modalities of thought and feeling and sensing, and beginning to validate this idea of sensory experience was to begin to kind of develop a coherence and a potency of this sensory language. And this is very important in autism. Um, Ultimately, when it came to writing, it had to be situated. So it had to be, what is the context of this? Do you know, we're talking about a practice that arises from Buddhism, from an Eastern understanding, and we're talking about it in the West. So we have a kind of Western perception of this, and autism is something which is a medical term. And in my mindfulness journey, I began to evolve the understanding of neurodiversity, which is a political term. So it's the kind of evolution, the emergence for me of this identity as an autistic neurodivergent person. My research question was, how does a mindfulness insight practice inform sense making in autistic Asperger's individuals? And I used autoethnography as a basis for this. So it was qualitative, it was all reflexive, and I drew on my own experience, my journals, and fact of poetry and artwork. And the sense making is, do you know, it all began to change when it comes up again and again through my dissertation. What I've found going along to Sammy to the mindfulness residentials was prepare yourself for constant transformation. So in developing the journey, your understanding changes and you begin to change. And it was kind of trusting that emergence and embracing the change, which enabled the kind of the mindfulness practice to deepen and grow into, well, I would like to think it's wisdom, but let's see. So the kind of the bricks and boards, the bare bones is, you know, knowing what is happening as it is happening without preference. And as ever, the difficult bit, the hard bit is the without preference. Is having this aversion or attraction, is sitting in the middle. I built a lot on the idea of Frankl and the pause between stimulus and response. There is a pause, and that goes all the way through mindfulness from Thich Nhat Hanh, Kramer, Tara Brach uses it. A lot of people talk about the pause, and in the pause arises the power to make your own choice, to make a different choice from a reaction. So without preference took a lot of learning to get there, and the dimmer switch, and becoming aware of what else is in the room, and then recognizing what is happening as it is happening. And the rest is just muscle. And I still practice almost every day, and it's still something which kind of guides how I am in the world. But specifically for autism, it was this idea of being able to observe thoughts without being entangled with them. So from Stephen Hayes, from acceptance and commitment work, is looking at your thoughts, not from your thoughts. And this, to go a little bit deeper with this, is to look at what is a non-conceptual form of self-awareness that manifests as a witnessing perspective, not entangled in the contents of awareness. The old metaphor of the riverbank, of falling in the river and getting entangled in thoughts, and then arising, displaying, and liberating, allowing the thought to let go and climbing back onto the riverbank again, again without preference. And in the course of my mindfulness, of my MSc, I read quite widely in some of the Buddhist teachings, some of the books, and I found a lot of resonance with this. And Thranga Rinpoche, the crystal clear, was beautiful, because it gave the the mind. They say it's emptiness, but when you kind of inquire into that, there's no shape, there's no color. It's just this awareness, this understanding and reflection, and it's luminous. And in the pause, suddenly we have a kind of a non-conceptual awareness that is luminous. And credit to Jane Kellogg, thank you very much. I read some of The Mindful Life, and it's the observer and up to the point of insight, and then there's only observing, and this is shifting from that dualism. If in the Mindfulness Association Insight audios, there is a practice of observing the observer, and this is turning 180 degrees and observing the observer and getting to this point of the pause, of the emptiness, of the luminosity. And this is, I find, hugely nourishing, however it's perceived Buddhistly. Okay, so the kind of the nuts and bolts of the inquiry is, how do I do this? How do I approach? This was kind of going into lockdown, so it was going into 2020, into the COVID pandemic, and it became very difficult to do any kind of work with participants. It kind of technically was possible to do it online, but it was quite difficult. So I used various online stuff, and I used 4 different aspects to the methodology. And essentially, I know there's probably people watching this, or will be watching later on the website, that are studying autism, and I will try and locate this, situate it in the kind of the explanation of the autistic perception. So it's this idea of moving from sensory reasoning, sensory perception, to linguistic perception. So the autoethnography is, it was from my own experience, and it was about my journey. But in how do we perceive our own moment to moment experience? This is like the thinking, feeling, sensing. It's like to connect with the deeper wisdom is to how do I sense this? So the phenomenology is to get in Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, is to get into the actual moment of perception, and just be with it. And then, do you know, how do we reflect on that? Becomes a separate thing. So we have perception itself, and then we have how do we talk about it? So it becomes relational and it becomes linguistic. So we move from sensory reasoning to a linguistic reasoning. So I kind of use poetry, and poetry, Erin Manning is good. Poetry stands on the cusp of where does our feeling of what we're saying actually meet the linguistic reality of what we're saying. It's the poetry is a sense medium. It's a felt medium. So this was to reflect the phenomenology. I used the poetry, and then I used the discourse analysis to really kind of unpack how do we talk about things like non-conceptual awareness? How can we actually understand how we're making meaning? Because we're moving from a pre-verbal sense to a verbal sense. And for autistic people, this is kind of very interesting because it's very Daniel Tammet says autistic people live as foreigners in our own language. And the act of talking to other people suddenly becomes an intersubject from a subjective position to an intersubjective position. It becomes a different language. And how do we form that from a pre-verbal sense? How do we articulate meaning in language? Is an inquiry in itself. How it must be situated was situated in autistic advocacy, and I'll come on to that at the conclusion. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, Jane.
You probably have around about 5 or 6 minutes, maybe a little bit more.
Okay.
The dog's barking away in the background there.
No problem. Okay. So I unpacked the DSM to kind of really look at do you know what's going on, and the idea of monoliteralism I learned from Vermeulen, and I now know this as monotropism, and I'll explain that shortly. The phenomenology I explored was the non-conceptual awareness, as I've explained, and I validated the different sensory modalities, including synesthesia and hypersensitivity to color, and situated these in the instinctual knowing of the body-mind. The idea of language, do you know, from the sensory modalities, how do we talk about feeling? Because art is language, color is language, synesthesia it's its own language, music is language. All of these are coherent languages to talk about mindfulness. It's kind of like the practice of dropping a pebble in a clear pool of water and then letting it be and just seeing what arises. So what language arises? How do you feel it? How do you sense it? How do you express it? Again, that's in the cultural context. So autism as advocacy. Autism it's not a cognitive deficit. That's the misnomer. It's a disability of social communication, and this is a language issue. It can be understood and situated through the social model of disability. That is the functional impairment. Is it a sensory impairment, or is it just a difference? Is it just a statistical difference? Because it can be shown to be a coherent cognitive strategy. And disability is socially constructed. So this is the loss of limitation or opportunities to take part in the normal life of the community because of social barriers that are constructed. The flight of stairs was not constructed, it was not designed by a guy in a wheelchair. That's the disability, was the assumption that everybody has functional legs. For an autistic person, the disability is the assumption that we all communicate in the same way. The rules of social interaction are not perceived in the same way for autistic people from non-autistic people. Again, monolateralism and uh, Japanese advocate Naoki Higashida says, I have to speak in a foreign language every day to be understood. Do you know, this idea of translating to be understood, it goes from subjective to intersubjective. At this point, we can translate the medical label of autism into the political identity of neurodiversity. This is the politics of disability. And we begin to deconstruct the social model of disability with respect to this language disability. So the conclusion, mindfulness to me was immeasurably valuable in developing for my social development and in developing an understanding of myself. Non-conceptual awareness, transcendent compassion, still day to day, still part of my practice, part of my life. The MSc put me on the path that's led to my doctorate, and I'm hugely grateful for this. And the thing to take away, particularly for these guys studying protected characteristics, is monotropism, because this, if you skip down to the second from last bullet point, it is for example, in a practice like sound support, you develop settling, grounding, resting, and you have an interoceptive focus, and then it's intrinsic, and then if you settle on sound support, you go to an extrinsic focus, and this is like the difference of being in an attentional tunnel to being polytropic, to being aware of sounds in the room, sounds around the body. And if you can find this bridge, it enables a kind of growth and a confidence of autistic people to bridge from their own what can be a misanthropic world, this attentional tunnel, into a social world. So it needs some work, it needs some development, but it's a hugely powerful validation of mindfulness as being effective not for treatment of autism, because we don't want a cure. It's about self-development and self-management for autistic and neurodivergent people. So with that, I think we go to questions. Okay.